All right, this could be a bit of a spicy one. Separation of concern is one of those things that I'm actually quite passionate about. And I watched this one through 1.5 times speed earlier because I was in a bit of a rush, but thought I'd jump on and rewatch it and kind of get my thoughts out loud because I think we've got some pretty big misconceptions, or at least some takes here that are very contextual to what Theo does. You know, I like Theo. I think he has some good takes generally, but I'm not sure this is one of them.
Here I go causing drama again. I've been thinking about this video a lot. I've wanted to do it for probably over a year now. As we've talked about with everything from Tailwind to server components, I don't find separation of concerns as a default to be a great experience. And
I think as a default is an important note. And also the two things he mentioned, server components and Tailwind, both, you know, while server components are server side, both built in front end technology.
I hear all sorts of arguments for it. And every time I do, they feel like they hold less and less water. If you're not already familiar with the concept, separation of concerns is the idea that you should break apart your app and categorize it by the types of things parts do. The most common way to do this is through the MVC model.
I think separation of concern isn't just about the structural pattern that you use to build your application, but also within your application, domain. If you're working against like maybe some domain driven design, then you might separate based on the specific parts of that domain. So it isn't just about the structural pattern. So that's kind of like maybe one take that's a little off. But, you know, we'll hear them out.
Model view controller model. So if I define these things myself, everybody's gonna be mad. So I'm using the Wikipedia definition. The model is the central component of the pattern. It's the application's dynamic data structure independent of the user interface. Notice how they have to specify this, because normally the data structure is defined by the user interface.
In front-end applications.
The view is the thing that actually shows whatever the model has determined to the user. In the controller.
And this is one of the things that I think is quite central to his point, and one of the fundamental kind of the reason why it's so contextual and why I don't think what he's saying really applies to the sort of original definition of separation of concern.
Is what accepts the inputs and converts it to commands for the model or the view. This separation is entirely arbitrary and makes no sense in modern times at all. When all of these things were different parts of your infrastructure and HTML as the view was an incredibly limited piece, this model made a lot of sense. When you look at things like Angular, especially the OG Angular JS, it's clear they were building around this model. But when you look at React, they kind of threw it away because React didn't see MVC as a necessary way to separate things. They saw an opportunity to allow developers to separate things how they chose.
But that's a good point, but it doesn't stop no matter how like over or under engineered or complex your front end application is, your front end application is fundamentally your view. So whether you have server-side components or you have components within your React app or your Next app or whatever, speaking to or acting as a backend or a source of data, it's still fundamentally the view. So whether you're almost creating a layer of like middleware between your server and your view, your actual view that is displayed, your JSX, which is then, eventually HTML. It's a kind of like you're shoehorning this view that's kind of semi-base. I think maybe the issue really is he's talking about an issue with MVC rather than separation of concern.
Effectively took these parts, combined them together, and gave you, as a developer, the ability to define the boundaries yourself. And the tweet that inspired this video most recently comes from...
Well, because the whole React paradigm is based around components, right?
Mark Dalgish, the creator of Vanilla Extract, one of the OG CSS wizards, especially in the React world. He helped create CSS modules, and now he's working on Remix. He tweeted this a couple weeks ago. Been over 8 years since this commit, and I still can't apologize enough. Truly, I'm sorry. What is this commit? This is him adding the no set state rule into ESLint plugin React. What this rule does is it allows you to specify that no components can actually update their own state. So if you want to do state updates, you would do that externally through like a UI library, like Material UI or something. And then the components themselves just pass data in a very static way. The goal of this was to separate the update layer from the React view layer. Because at the time, if you were really deep...
I'm not going to pretend I know too much about React and too much about OG React, or any of these kind of front end technologies, but I know enough about the architecture and the higher level to not comment on these specifics. So
in the MVC mindset, this seemed like a good idea. The harsh reality of this is that it made our lives exponentially more complex. When you want to make a change, maybe you want to change what state is the default or what.
I think that's just a bad architectural decision, though. It's nothing to do with having some like predefined conceptions about MVC.
The behavior is when a user does a certain thing, or just have code that runs when the state changes. If that state is 7 layers away from where you currently are, even finding the file it's in is going to be a massive challenge, and updating it in a way where it doesn't break other things is nightmarish. The closer you...
And I agree, but it sounds more of a domain modeling problem or a problem modeling problem than something that's anything to do with the broader structural pattern, which is MVC. Or separation of concern. I mean, I know that Theo isn't a big believer or advocate for object-oriented design because of the abstractions and the different layers, but I feel like this is more of what his issues with than it is around having separation of the concern of what it is that's interacting with other things. Maybe it's the shoehorning of these more OO design principles into something that's more component-driven and is more... You
can locate the things that affect your code and the code that causes them to appear in the first place, the easier it is to maintain, understand, review, work with, and maintain that code over time.
Which I agree.
I've never in my life, regardless of the scale of company, worked in a code base where the separation of concerns made real changes easier to understand and do. Because what ends up happening is you miss one of the 15 places that needs to be changed for that code to work, and it looks fine in code review, but because you...
Again, it feels like a scenario where you do object-oriented programming wrong, where it's not fully object-oriented programming. You have this like mashup of some object-oriented principles where you might have these different elements that control the behaviors of different elements, and you're working around this primary object, but then you kind of shoehorn in this procedural, functional element. So if you don't have this like kind of type safety, or you don't have this this connection, this relationship between every stage of the process, it sounds more of like a design problem than a problem with having your concerns separated.
You don't see all of the ways this code impacts things. It's actually very broken. And if you have one component that has all of your model logic separated from the actual places being consumed, and you make a change to that code, it's not apparent in the code review which things are actually affected by that change, because you're just seeing the code itself that changed, not the places it's being consumed.
But again, that's for example, the model that should be, containing your data and also containing maybe some domain logic, small amount of domain logic that's pertinent to that data. If that model's being used by a view, for example, the public API of that model, it's pertinent. If you're changing the public API of an object, then you need to make sure that downstream those changes are backwards compatible. So that's like just a fundamental error in the understanding of what needs to the scope of the change. That's just underestimating it. That's not checking. It doesn't. If you change a public API or something that's public facing, then you can't guarantee that the consumers or the clients of that API, whether that's a REST API or an object or a class or data structure, are going to know about that change. So that's why the changes either have to be backwards compatible or you have to version them. And that's more of an approach issue than it is an issue with separating the concerns or the design in the first place.
This is why this model doesn't make a lot of sense with modern development. This is also a huge part
with modern front-end development.
Why I like Tailwind. I know a lot of people are upset seeing so much words in their JSX and eventually in their HTML that gets output, but by co-locating the styles with the thing that renders them, it's become way easier to see exactly what's causing a behavior, to make changes when you want that behavior to be different, and to code review it when you want to see what they're doing. It's also made it way harder to accidentally leave.
Again, another issue with the whole abstraction and the whole over-engineering of, like, we have more complex views these days. We have functionality in the client, things that make and drive user experiences to be way better than they were when maybe we were server-side rendering some HTML in a PHP file and sending it out to the client. Like, I get what's possible and why we have the need for these more complex front ends. But again, it's more of a shoehorning architecture and the structural patterns into front ends applications and kind of treating them as if they are the whole stack. It's not about the infrastructure, it's about the design of your application.
Old styles behind, because if you separate your styles into a different file that has CSS in it and you stop using the class, how do you know that you can delete that class safely? You don't, so it stays there forever. I will guarantee that at least a fourth of the CSS on the Twitch site right now is not being used for anything because they're scared to delete it, because there is no relationship between that CSS that's in the file and the actual thing rendering in the HTML other than being named correctly inside of the React code.
But that doesn't mean... That's why we've moved on, right? That's why a lot of people have moved away from traditional style sheets.
Component. And I can't tell you how many times I had code that should have worked that wasn't, and it turned out I just slightly misspelt the name or forgot what it was from a CSS file and was accessing it in the component. Or worse, there was two things that had the same name for the CSS. It's unreliable at best.
I agree, but it's not.
But we haven't even got to
argument
the fun part, which is the server client side of things. You might think that my stance stops once we hit the server. It's like, obviously the server needs to be a controller of some form, and the UI takes what that sends it and does whatever it has to from there. What if I told you the server could just send the right HTML depending on the conditions and interface with it in the same code directly? We've done a lot of examples with server components in my content, but I really want to emphasize this. So here's a really basic example. Const data equals await get images for user. This is a SQL call. I just put it in a function so I can call it in 3 places, but it is just a SQL call, and I return.
But this just isn't fundamentally MVC. It's not separation of concern. Again, I think Theo's issue is with MVC. It's not with the having separation of concern, because you still have a separation of concern because your controller is actually now what handles the logic and what dictates the server. You just got a different structural pattern.
Image grid, which is a React component. Fun fact, both of these are actually defined in the same file, if I recall correctly. By keeping these all in the same place, it becomes much easier to see what the backend returns and how it affects the UI. So if we're trying to add a new feature, let's say if they have 0 images, we want to return something different. That goes from annoying to trivial, both to figure out where that happens and what the relationship is.
I'm going to kind of skip
error, and now if you have to maintain, significantly harder to understand the impact of a change on either side. This is why GraphQL was invented, because it was so hard to manage this and properly define the many different permutations of the backend stuff that the front end needs. But if we don't define that separation by default, we allow the developers using this code and building these things to define these boundaries where it makes sense for what they're building. It becomes
I'm a big believer in having the right bounded context. But I think it's just not the issue of having the concerns separated. What he's proposing is completely changing up the model, and I agree that MVC doesn't fit in front end.
Easier to build, easier to maintain, easier to add features, easier to make changes to those features, and most importantly, easier to understand what the code does. And this is my problem. Separation of concerns is almost always sold as a solution to complexity. By separating these things into these boxes, you reduce the potential complexity of those things. What you've also done is increase the complexity of any given feature, because every feature is going to touch all of these boxes you've split up. That might be good if those boxes are the same shape as your teams, but that's not.
Which is why people often implement object-oriented or, object relating to other objects and having encapsulating different behaviors. Again, that's a whole different...
The case for most people, because teams are now being built around features, not around locations in the stack. And
which is, again, something I've spoken about before, Conway's Law, and around the way that the communication structures and the way teams communicate within an agency will often define the type and the structure of the structure of the application or the software that's delivered within that organization, within those teams. So if this is more a political thing. If we're forming teams around components, then you're making a rod for your own back, because you're putting yourself in a scenario where you are setting yourself up to have these sprawling separations. So it's a self-made problem.
And if I'm building a new feature on Twitch or on Upload thing, and I'm on the front end team and we need back end changes, now we have this whole process with.
There's a process, but there needs to be a contract that's defined and treat everything. I mean, I think someone from I think maybe even Bezos at Amazon said that all services must be built as if they're going to be publicly consumed services, ready for consumption. So that way, even if they're internal, the relationship and the communication that goes on when delivering these services is as if you aren't in control of what the other service that's consuming it is doing.
Back and forth with making changes that hopefully are backwards compatible, with realizing the API is slightly off from what we
That's where versioning comes in.
need and by bugging them to make additional changes. All of this separation makes it so much slower to move and takes away a lot of the confidence you normally would have when you make these changes. If the distance
It does, if you do it within the context that you're stuck in. It's a shift in the whole paradigm of the way it's being thought about.
between your infrastructure and your UI code wasn't multiple teams, files, code bases, and deployment infrastructure. And instead, the distance between those was 2 lines of code. It makes maintenance so much easier. And
It does, but then there are also other questions that come into it with scale.
that's why I'm getting frustrated.
I know he's worked at big companies, small companies, all the rest of it, but there's definitely a line there.
Because I've worked at a lot of different scales and I have seen separation of concerns cause significantly more problems than I've seen it solve. And
I think he's seen poor choice in architecture, poor choice in design patterns, and structural patterns cause problems, not separation of concern, in my opinion.
think it should be the default anymore. The default of a separated database, API with Express, and a single page app front end with the model, the view, and controller all separated on both the back end and the front end. This died with Rails.
Exactly. We don't need MVC on the front end. I think that's the fundamental takeaway.
This isn't how we should be building anymore. And continuing to take this old mindset and apply it like it somehow magically reduces complexity, it's harmful. And I'm really tired of us pretending these things should be just because. I'm sure a lot of people are going to disagree, and I'm actually excited to see the comments on here. So if you think...
And that's it. I think the real takeaway, my real take on it is MVC isn't a front end conversation. The front end is the view. If you are implementing the MVC structural pattern as a whole over your whole deliverable, you're getting your whole user experience or how your user consumes your service or your product or experience, I guess, because there are so many in modern application development. There are so many different layers to it, so many different potential ways to go about it. If MVC is the overarching, you shouldn't be trying to shoehorn MVC into the view because it's the view already. It should just do view things. And if you don't want it to just do view things, if you want your front end to be complex and to handle more of the logic, it's more, if anything, it's bad separation of concern that's got them into the problem where separation of concern is the issue, because actually you're not separating the concern of the business logic and of the data that's returned should be defined by the model and the controller, not putting it into the view and then wondering why the view doesn't know about what the rest of the parts of the application or the application as a whole was doing. So I think it's not really a conversation for the front end. The front end either needs to be the front end or it doesn't need to be the front end. If the application itself for the front end, talking in kind of React or Next context, needs to speak to other services and it shouldn't be viewed as the front end. And I think we could probably both agree that for a React app, MVC really probably isn't the model because it's not built around object-oriented programming, which I think MVC really fits more into as a structural pattern in that sense. If you're going to be components, they should adopt a model or a pattern that works for the way it was designed. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments, and I will I'll catch you next one. Peace.